the Liberty Podcast with Clint Armitage. We are proclaiming liberty one show at a time, and the next one starts right now. Hey, all right, everybody. It's Clint Armitage with the Liberty Podcast. So we're on our second day this week, or second episode of Movie Week. And the last one was about the Rapture. It was called The Remaining. So I hope you like that little review. And now we're going to be talking about one that's actually a little bit older. This one is called 90 Minutes in Heaven. It came out in 2015, it looks like. It's based on a real-life story, which I love. I love real-life stories. It's a story about a guy by the name of Don Piper. So what happened to him was he was driving home from a minister's conference. This is back in 1989. And while he was driving home, a semi-truck crossed over into his lane and literally just smashed his car and him. The semi just rolled over the darn car as they were driving. Anyways, he is smashed in this car. You know, he's got all kinds of crazy injuries and he's pronounced dead at the scene. And then 90 minutes goes by. So he's been dead for 90 minutes. And another minister who went to the same conference as him was coming back along the same road. You know, they were all stopped because of the accident. And so he came up because he felt compelled to pray for the guy that was injured in the car. So he went to go pray for him. And then as he was praying, he also sang praise songs as well. And then while this pastor was singing praise songs to Don Piper, Don actually becomes conscious, comes to, and starts singing the praise songs with him. And then that's how they know, like, oh gosh, he's alive, he's alive. So, but he's been dead for 90 minutes until he comes back and starts singing with the pastor. So anyways, that's the intro of the story. That's the gist of it. And he is like totally, his body is damaged. And so during this 90-minute time period, he's actually in heaven. So that's his book. That's what the movie is about, that he was in heaven for the time that he was pronounced dead here on earth. You know, he's in heaven, he's free, he's peaceful, he's, you know, no pain, no sorrow, nothing like that. Well, when he gets pulled back and he comes back and he's conscious now back on earth, he has to endure just a ton of pain and this recovery process that's taken forever that put him bedbound for 13 months. And so, you know, he's suffering this whole time and he wants to give up. He literally wants to give up. He doesn't want to do it. He doesn't understand why God would show him heaven and then take him back to earth to endure such hardship and pain. Again, it took about 13 months till he was able to actually just get out of bed. I mean, he was messed up. His arm was severed and his leg was barely attached to his body, you know, so, I mean, he was pretty messed up. So anyways, a long suffering period, a long recovery period, and he's a little bit bitter because he doesn't know why God is bringing him back when he got to taste heaven. And so it ends up that after this long recovery period, he starts to learn that God is using him and his story to bring people closer to God. And so he becomes a public speaker and then he writes the book and he finds his purpose in that. And so that's what the movie's about, basically. That's the gist of the movie. So I just saw that movie, you know, just recently again. And again, it's a little bit older. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about a couple of things in the movie that I thought were pretty interesting. And again, you may have seen this movie already because it's been out for, 8-9 years already. So it's not a new movie, but there was a couple things that I watched in the movie and it kind of stood out to me. So I want to talk about that. The first one is how the second minister was in the traffic, the backup, but he felt compelled to pray for him, pray for the guy that's in the accident. So he felt compelled. And so he, got out of his car, walked up to the accident scene. I guess he got permission from the state troopers or whoever the law enforcement was there, and prayed for him, sang with him. And then of course, that's when they found out he was alive again. And so that's the first thing one of the things I want to talk about is his compulsion to hear God. Well, his, the ability to hear God, and then his compulsion to go and follow follow God's direction. Because you think about it, like how often in a situation like that, if God is calling this guy to go and approach the state trooper or the law enforcement, whoever's, running the scene there and let him know, hey, I'm a pastor, I want to go pray for this guy or whatever. But it's being able to hear God's voice. And that's what I want to kind of highlight, is the fact that he was able to hear God's voice, that still small voice, that same voice that spoke to Elijah, in the Old Testament. We've got to get better at being able to hear God. But the only way we're going to do that is really get connected to him. We have to read more, read the Bible more. We have to connect with God, pray more, have this line of communication so that when he does speak to us, we can hear him. We got to get rid of a lot of distractions in our lives, a lot of voices. I call a lot of voices in my head because there's just too many things going on, too many, things talking to me, distracting me, and leading me away from what God wants me to do, or listening and hearing God. So I did want to mention that. The other thing I wanted to talk about too real quick was the fact that he is suffering for God's glory. Suffering for God's glory. It's interesting to me that we can be called to suffer for God. And yet, like him, I would, I could see doing the same thing where I'm bitter because I have to suffer now. Like, you give me a taste of heaven and now I have to suffer and endure through this whole recovery process and put my body back together in excruciating pain. Like, why? Why? And we ask that question. So I just want to encourage you to continue to get closer to God so that, one, we can hear him, but then two, if we are called to suffer for him, because that can happen. We can be called to suffer for him. When Jesus was speaking to Peter, when he spoke to Peter after he had resurrected, and they were out fishing and he was on the shore and he said, hey, throw the net on the other side. And they did it. And then one of them said, I think it was John, said, hey, that's the Lord. And then Peter jumped in the water and swam to the Lord. And then they brought the fish in and they were cooking breakfast and all that. Well, when he was talking to Peter, he told him that he was going to be taken where he didn't want to go. And they were going to do things to him. And basically what he was talking about was the crucifixion, the upside down crucifixion that Peter was going to endure. He was going to die for God's glory, but he was going to do it in a way he did not want because he was going to suffer. And again, to be crucified upside down. And yet, because he didn't think he was worthy to be crucified like Jesus. So he got crucified upside down. But what I got out of that was the fact that Jesus was letting Peter know that he was going to suffer for God's glory. And so sometimes we're called to that. And man, I definitely want to avoid it as if I could, right? Even Jesus, he asked God the Father if the cup could pass from him. So he didn't have to go through the crucifixion either. But he said at the end of that, not my will, but your will be done. Knowing that, he was going to have to go through this, he did still ask God the Father. And of course, God did not allow that because Jesus had to die and suffer for our sins. But we may be called to suffer in some certain circumstances. Like this guy here, Don Piper. He was driving. It wasn't his fault. It was the the guy that was driving the semi truck crossed over into his lane and ran him over, his whole car over. So he wasn't in control of that. And it wasn't like he was sinning and he was getting punished or anything like that. He was just in a situation that God allowed. And from that situation, he had to suffer. And then not only that, he was able to see heaven and then had to come back and suffer. But it was for God's glory. And in the end, he realized that. So I just want to encourage you. If you're going through suffering right now, allow God to help you through the suffering, lead you through the suffering, teach you through the suffering, because if he's allowing the suffering, then you're going to get something out of it. And it's only temporary, even though it may be a long time. He was bedbound for 13 months in this movie. But I just want to encourage you, because we all go through suffering, and sometimes we have to suffer a little bit more in certain circumstances, but basically everybody suffers in this life. But sometimes God is getting glory from suffering. So sometimes we're called to it, like Peter was. So just stay strong in the Lord. Cry out to him to help you, to lead you, to teach you, to navigate so that you can complete whatever you're supposed to be doing. And hopefully the Lord will be merciful. All right. Thanks for stopping by. Again, this is the Liberty Podcast, and this was the second part of Movie Week, and it was the movie 90 Minutes in Heaven. Until next time, stay safe, stay motivated, and keep seeking liberty. for another episode of the Liberty Podcast with Clint Armitage. If you want to get in touch, email us at info@clintarmitage.com.